We're going to talk about the Catfish Farm. That was my first assignment. I came to work in July, as Gary mentioned, of '91, and the Catfish Farm was already going and creating a lot of anxiety, and I was sent out there to do a field investigation. And the central character in this is one Ronnie Pucek. Here is the setting for the Catfish Farm. This is more or less the bad water line. This is the Medina River, and that little nose right there, he's right in there. This is a picture over there in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide of conduits that were put into the 2004 USGS ModFlow model update, and the Catfish Farm is right in there somewhere. Now, I've added, at great graphical expense, an icon of where the Applewhite Reservoir is. And the Applewhite Reservoir plays heavily in this whole story because Ronnie's idea from the very get-go was to find something that would get the most water out of the ground and be legit so he could market it. He anticipated, paid good money for legal research that legislation was likely to come down, but he also knew that the Applewhite Reservoir, for those of you that may have been around during that time, and I came right after the first vote, really had a very low firm yield. The Medina River just doesn't have enough watershed to generate firm yield, and he was counting on keeping water in that reservoir because one of the very, very few regulatory duties or authority that the old EUWD had was they had a minimal amount of authority to regulate water being transported out of the district. And his legal research was a little bit concerned that once it got into the river and transported out, that might be problematic. So the Applewhite Reservoir was going to solve that problem. It wasn't going to be transported out of the district. That's Ronnie right there, and he's meeting with Nelda Weatherly. Before there was San Antonio Water System, there was the City Water Board, and Nelda Weatherly was the chair of the City Water Board. One of the consultants that Mr. Pucek had employed, they of course were letting City Water Board know that they were going to have all this water coming down the river, so they were going to help out with the reservoir. So as we learned through discovery and depositions, a consultant had actually penned a letter for Nelda Weatherly's signature that she in fact did sign, welcoming Ronnie to the community and looking forward to working with him. So he was out peddling that water in any way that he could. But like about everybody else in the world, he was a copycatter. The Raceway technology that we're going to see here as we shoot through some slides were absolutely not his. He had a marketing degree from Rice, so he was not an unintelligent person. He knew what he was doing. But he got his idea from Leo Ray. Leo Ray started this up in Idaho, and you see these are called raceways. They're just concrete tanks, they're just stair-stepped. And one flows into the other, and the way many of them are put together on the Snake River here in the bottom left of this slide, these are giant basalt flows out there, and they have some tremendous springs. And this particular one, they capture the water from this spring and then run it through these raceways, and then it goes into the river. Other raceway operations just capture river water, run it through. But because it's so cold, there's no consequence to the water quality of the receiving water. Now here's a layout of the operation. This one was drawn by me from memory, and this one I found in the files today from their consultant, but this is looking mostly north. Here's the Medina River. If you're familiar with the area, Pleasanton Road kind of comes in right on the northwest corner here. 1604 is down on the bottom. It may be hard for you to see, but that says irrigation well. He took over an operation out there. It was the old Knowlton dairy, and that well was on the property. That well, I don't know, I think I saw it. It produced about 3,500 gallons a minute, and that's where he got the idea that he wanted about 25,000 gallons a minute for some reason. At least that's what we learned, and he wanted to run it off the ground. So the water goes into this lined canal that they made, and it goes into here's the raceways. Now this is obviously two-dimensional, so you stair step down all these, and then it goes through a clarifier, and then it goes into a bottom set of raceways. Then everything dumps into a bio-filtration pond, which was just an artificially bermed tank to sort of slow the water down, because they thought there might be some solids. And then it goes into, there was an already existing gravel operation, and his original plan was that it would just get into this gravel, and that loose soil, it would just seep into the river. And so he had told the then Water Commission that there was not going to be a discharge, so he was not required to get a discharge permit, because he said there would be no discharge.
What's the footprint of the raceway?
I'm sorry?
What's the footprint of the raceway?
Each of these raceways, as I recall, they're about 8 foot wide, about 16 foot long, and about 6 to 8 foot deep.
And there's a series of them.
Yeah, oh yeah, there's like 42 tanks, I think. So we're gonna kind of break it down and go through a piece at a time. We're gonna start with the top part, the head of the operation, and then we're gonna go to the heart, where all the fish were raised, and then we're gonna go to the bowels, so to speak. Like I said, this was the original well. The first well that he drilled for his newfound venture was this well. It's not an industrial well. The bad water line is actually closer to this way. He didn't know that. That well was just mineralized enough that with hydrogen sulfide mostly, that he feared that would not work. So he abandoned that one and then drilled this one, which we'll find out in a minute was all that he needed. Now, but he went ahead and captured that as part of the operation. Here you see the well. They had tried to clean it up. That didn't work. And they just pumped the water underground. They had a real small gravel washing operation part of the plant. Here's the big kahuna. This was a picture in the Texas Water Wells Journal when they were actually drilling it, and you can see the thing was gushing up then. This is the driller's log, and I know it's really hard to see. It was completed originally in August of 1990, and the original pilot hole was 10 inches all the way to 1,780 feet. When they saw what they had, they went back and bored it out, and they have 34-inch casing down to 1,500 and some, and then they have 28-inch casing from 1,585 to 1,670. And right here, I know you can't read that, there was a 10-foot cave. And Tommy Johnson, a local well driller, estimated in March of '91 when they were finishing it off, I don't know how, I wasn't here then, but somehow they estimated the flow to be 37,000 gallons a minute. But that was just an estimate. So it was a remarkable well. I do not know of another, and there was no pumps. There was never a pump in the well. I do not know of another larger flowing well in the world, but that is probably a function of my very small mind. So when it came in, as represented in the Bible, there was a lot of gnashing of teeth and pulling of hair. And so some folks went about and they passed at least one bill, and here's a section of the bill that was added, and that's a poor picture of Governor Ann Richards coming right down here at a senior citizen center and signing the bill, and I think it was like September, because I was here for that. And it basically said if someone's going to drill another well and it flows more than 5,000 gallons a minute and it's less than 1,000 feet from another well, they have to do something. But to my knowledge, there's not been one consequence of that piece of legislation. It was just paper. But here's what it looked like when they completed it. They put this big, this is for some reason this picture looks like the Martian land surface. Everything's a little red and orange. But this is a concrete bowl, and the casing just stubbed up here, and then it geysered up, and then it flowed through a couple of culvert pipes into a channel that we'll see in a minute. But even though that well was improved, it still had enough hydrogen sulfide, and there was not enough oxygen that as he populated those tanks with fish, the lower, because there's two sets, the lower bank of tanks were having huge die-offs, and they decided it was because of that. So he came up with this really pretty frickin' genius idea. He manufactured this elbow, and he's got a bunch of slots in it, and there's a big, like a big screen you'd put over a barbecue, and it's just like wiffle balls in there. Just thousands of them. And what he did was he bled off the hydrogen sulfide, and he added oxygen. It was really genius. And that seemed to help out. He had talked to someone a gentleman named Kelly, I can't recall his last name, in Arkansas, that also had a catfish operation, but one that was normal. It was a pond. And that individual had informed him that during the winter months, the fish didn't gain any weight. The water just got cool enough that they just sort of went in a dormant state. But the water at the catfish farm was about, 85 to 90 degrees. So it was much warmer. He thought that was a golden opportunity to be able to raise fish year-round, but there was a consequence. You can see the date here, October 91. I'd only been here 2 months, 3 months. And this is EUWD staff, and we're out there grabbing samples. This is that big manifold. This is as it's just flowing into this canal that goes to the fish tanks. Now, I know you can't see this, but this is taken at the wellhead. That's well 617. And right over here is fecal coliform, fecal strep, and total coliform. And there's basically nothing. Remember that.
What's the TDS?
The TDS, let's see, I've got it right here. Let me see. I'd never read it off there. Well, conductivity is 598. So I don't see a TDS listed here. Not much. It was good water. It had a little smell. Here's the rest of the operation now. This is when I was going rogue back in 91. I was explaining to these gentlemen that pink is manly. The culvert pipes are coming out here. Here's the canal. The canal had extended further because early they thought that first well might work until they realized it wasn't. And then the canal just goes right on down, and you can't see it, but that's the top of the feeding operation right up there. And here is the canal's coming in right here, and it hits this sort of steel barrel, and it splits the water, and it fills this channel, and then there's portholes underneath this that you can't see below water level. Here you can see where they're just gushing water. And this stair-stepping action was intended to add oxygen, which it did, but it didn't get enough in initially because of the high hydrogen sulfide. Let's see, I wanted to also show you that, let's go to this next one, yeah. Originally the tanks were just open tanks. And apparently they had two negative consequences. One of them was the fish were getting sunburned because they had to cook, so to speak, for 144 days, and that sun was a little intense. But the other thing was there were a lot of predation. Birds would land on there and get after them. So they had to add these screens to cover them to get shade and to keep the birds out. And then they had these giant feeders that just slid on these rails back and forth and dropped pellets in there. And here's here's a picture looking down. You can see the stair-step nature, and you can see the shading. You can't really see any fish there. They had I guess they had a watch out station for someone to watch the fish in case something went wrong, and they had a giant storage tank. And then one of the things that was supposed to happen, this is a clarifier, which is this piece here. After the first set of, after water went through the first set of raceways, it went through a little canal, and then it sort of centrifugally spun around, and they expected there'd be some solid waste, and the idea was to get that solid waste out, which they carted underground and just dumped it right here in the, I mean, it was just this sludge pit to get rid of that stuff. This is the fish, and you can see they were just packed in there. They look black, but they were actually gray. And here is a bird that was trying to take advantage of the shade and some feed. The other thing that became a problem, we'll see that in the next few slides, he didn't count on the velocity. You know, when we were out there, our first field investigation, it was in 91, we were able to get USGS to go with us. And because they'd done such a marvelous job of lining those canals and making them perfect symmetry, we were able to measure the water velocity coming out of that well, and it was right at 25,000 gallons a minute, just short. There was just so much velocity that the initial food they had was just a pellet stuff, and you can't see it here, I'm sorry, but if the resolution were higher, can you see that it looks like there's little rough areas? That's fish food that's floating off the tanks. The early problem they had was that food was just getting away from them. The fish weren't being able to get enough because the velocity was just carrying it from one tank to the next tank to the next tank downstream. And you'll see the consequences of that in a minute. But there were just a lot of the logistics that they hadn't worked out. Fecal coliform became a big issue for us, and we'll see that some numbers specifically. But the two issues were the fecal coliform counts and waste. There was a west set of tanks that, as you can see here, this was later in the fall. They never had any fish in that one. At least they never while we were out there the last few months of 91. And they had so much extra water. Not only did they have water in those tanks, but they had another culvert right on the side, right over here, that they just dumped water in, and then it just bypassed everything and went straight in. This is the bio-filtration pond. So, I mean, there was just way more water coming off that property than they could ever use for those fish. Now we're moving downstream. We're in the bio-filtration pond because you can see it kind of bends, and so we're at the road, we're looking back up, and you can see the bottom one dumping out. And you see all these green hummocky things? That is algal mass buildup from April to October of 91. Just in that short time, because of that warm water, because of all of the vegetation all the food that got away from them, and the fact that the fish were producing massive amounts of fecal coliform. Here I am again, still being pretty in pink. Now we're down in the biofiltration pond. We're grabbing some samples. Here's another water quality sample. Again, I apologize you can't read that, but now those numbers read on the, let's see, where did I put it? On the fecal coliform, 15,400, and the limit was 200. On the fecal strep, it was too numerous to count, and on the total coliform was 96,600. So it was quite a little bio operation going on here. That's why I called it the Catfish Farm. Very clever name. Now we're right at the edge of the biofiltration pond, and you can see, just look at this massive buildup of all this algal stuff. I mean, that's just, you can see it's October 18th, 1991. I think he put fish in there April 1st. So what was that, 8 months, 7 months? That warm water was just going crazy. And here, this is in the gravel pit at the very bottom. You can just see these floating mats of algal, glopida. I'm not a biologist. Here is the bottom end of the gravel pit. And you remember me telling you before that he didn't have to get a discharge permit because he wasn't going to discharge into the river? Well, he may have been a marketing major, but he was not a geologist. He didn't know about soils. He was assuming that because the soil was just so loose, it was just reworked alluvium, that water would get down to that gravel pit and it would just seep through the edge of that pit and into the Medina River, get plenty of water into the Medina River. And he thought 25,000 gallons a minute was no big deal. Well, it was a big deal. When that thing started ripping and roaring, apparently, from what we were told, the water almost went over that bank, and he was afraid the whole thing was going to wash out, so he had to hire someone to come in, cut a notch, so at least they could direct it out of there. And the notch, again, worked very well for doing a water flow measurement, and our determination was that from top to bottom, he only lost like 5%, which he interpreted as being 95% efficient. And here, this is looking into the gravel pit, and this is looking right into the Medina River. I mean, it went right straight into the Medina River. Now, as I mentioned early on, that well was near, or maybe in, one of the assumed conduits in the new model. The well was we sent the fecal coliform information to EPA, and their ears and eyes perked up, and they sent a letter to the Catfish Farm telling him cease and desist, and he needed to have it shut in by the end of November or face a huge fine. And he did. He shut it in on the 23rd of November, 1991. Steve Johnson, I know you're here. Where are you, Steve? Raise your hand. He did this graphic. Thank you, Steve. This is the actual water level measurements of J17, and then this is transposed rainfall that we've got for this period. From this period to the 8th, that's a good stopping point. That's roughly 15 days. That's 4.3 feet. Now this is 1/10 of an inch right here, so we might have got 3.5 inch of rain spread out over that time. But you notice in the first day, it just rocketed up. And that well, according to GIS, is, as the crow flies, 18.6 miles from J17. So 18.6 miles away, they were seeing a big boost. That was phenomenal well. But after the EPA got after him, then the Water Commission said, no, we need to have a hearing and talk about this discharge permit. So we had an expanded hearing, and there were a lot of parties involved. And at the end of the day, the Water Commission ruled that indeed he had to have one, and they were going to issue him one. But he had two requirements that he never could meet and never opened again. He had a thermal limitation. There was a mixing zone. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was strong enough that with the temperature differential of what coming off of his well, he could have never met that. And then the other one, of course, he had a fecal coliform limitation, which he couldn't meet. But once those things were issued, and once he went ahead and shut down, the old EUWD, along with San Antonio River Authority, was right with us from the very beginning in terms of pursuing litigation and challenging him. But there were several parties, including TNRCC had changed names by 93. We settled the lawsuit. The EUWD got all their money paid back, all the money we'd spent for litigation, for water quality testing, and then we also divided it with San Antonio River Authority. He retained his right to file for a permit. We said we wouldn't pursue anything with EPA, but we would also agree we might be a party to any proceedings when he applied for his permit with the EAA. But he did, at the end, in 2003, some 22 years later, he did find that pot of gold. Because it was all about getting water rights and selling them. And so this was an article out of the newspaper, and it was they're making the last sale in December of '03. The SAWS, Central Water System, purchased nearly 10,000 acre-feet for about $15,600,000, and that totaled $30 million that they had spent for getting 22,000 acre-feet, which meant that they spent about $1,337 per acre-foot, which pretty good price, one time to get all that water. That's phenomenal. So he got what he wanted. But I just found this when I was going through some files this week. You know, some things just die hard. Here, this was a November 1994 study. The former Bear Met, who they were a willing partner at one time. There was a news story once we started making it known about the fecal coliform levels. There was a news story in which Ronnie Pucek was interviewed with Tom Moreno of Bear Met, and they were out there with wine glasses allegedly drinking out of the water, saying, no, there's nothing wrong with it. I don't know what they were really drinking. I know they weren't drinking that stuff, but Bear Met, even in 1994, they did a study, all those yellow highlighted areas, they were doing a water supply study for South Bexar County, and they were still anticipating maybe capturing as much as 60,000 acre-feet of effluent. So they thought he might get going again, but he never did. Thank you.